Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we are going to start Unit 1, Realist and Neo-Realist Approaches. Let us first have introduction about the unit. Of the major approaches to the study of international relations, realism has by far proved to be the most influential theory in explaining the nature of the world politics. What probably explains its dominance as a school of thought is its ability to provide the most powerful explanation for the state of war, which characterizes the regular condition of life in the international system. This, however, does not mean that its basic assumptions have remained unchallenged, as would become clear in the later part of this unit. The realist perspective has come under the fierce criticism. As you go along this unit, the relative strengths and weaknesses of realist approach will become clearer to you. Now, the point is, what is realism? Realism, also known as political realism or realpolitik, continues to remain one of the dominant school of thought within the domain of international relations. Although its genesis can be traced back to the Thucydides' account of Peloponnesian War and to Sun Tzu's classical work on strategy. The Art of War, written at roughly the same time in China, realism emerged as a dominant international perspective only during the 20th century. More specifically, it emerged in its modern form largely in reaction to idealism, a more normatively driven approach which held that countries were united in an underlying harmony of interest. A view shattered by the outbreak of Second World War. Rather than study the world as it might be, realists maintained that a science of international politics must study the world as it was, an insistence that resulted in the realist self-acclaimed appellation. In contrast to the idealist, a term retrospectively coined by the realists for the interwar scholars, whose major preoccupation was with understanding the cause of war and finding a lasting remedy for its existence. War to the realist appears as a natural phenomena given the inherent craving for power in human nature. While idealism emphasizes that international relations should be guided by morality, realism is grounded in an emphasis on power politics and the pursuit of national interest. But what do these mean? As you go along this unit, the meanings and implications of such expressions frequently used in the literature on international relations would become clear to you. However, before we get down to explaining these terms, we must take note of the fact that from the perspective of the realist framework, states are recognized as preeminent actors in world politics. What provides weight to such an assumption is the accompanying notion of sovereignty, which enables the state to act as independent and autonomous entities both within and outside the nation state. The rise of nationalism and the emergence of modern nation state have further consolidated such a belief system by transforming the different states into cohesive political communities within which all other loyalties and ties remain subordinate to the nation state. By logical extension, all non state actors like multinational corporations and intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations are relegated to a peripheral status within the international system. Despite the growing recognition of the fact that such non state entities do significantly influence the outcome of developments in international relations, the realists are unwilling to budge from their position as far as preeminence of nation state in the international system is concerned. While conceding that the non state actors do operate within the political arena, the realists argue that the state supremacy remains unchallenged as they do not do so only by the consent of national political authorities. Nothing, the realists argue, is above the state. Now let us discuss one realism or many. There is no consensus among theorists of international relations with regard to the taxonomy of realism. The question as to whether realism constitutes a single coherent theory or there are different strands within realism has proved increasingly contentious. Nevertheless, different classificatory schemes are often used to separate one strand of realism from another. Generally speaking, the realist school can be divided into two broad categories: classical realism and contemporary realism or neo realism. First of all, let us discuss classical realism. Classical realism represents a world whole view of international politics encompassing several generations of theorists, ranging from Thucydides, Machiavelli, and E.H. Kerr to Hans I. Morgenthau, the famous high priest of post-war realism. The central argument of classical realism rests on the assumption that international politics is driven by an endless struggle for power, which has its root in human nature. In this framework, justice, law, and society have either no place or are circumscribed. Classical realism recognizes that the principles are subordinated to policies and that the ultimate test of the state leader lies in accepting and adapting to the changing world power political configurations in world politics. Classical realism as a school of thought became fashionable more particularly during the interwar period when a new generation of scholars got actively engaged in explaining new development in international relations. Classical realist, a term of retrospectively used by later band of realists, is thus often attributed to those theorists who were actively written on international relations immediately before and after the Second World War. What distinguishes this genre of scholars from others is their shared belief in an essentially pessimistic view of human nature. Some of the key figures in this tradition of realist school like Reinhold Niebuhr, Nicholas Spikeman, Hans Morgenthau, and others believe that the struggle for power is inherent in human nature. In other words, the drive for power and the will to dominate are treated as the fundamental trait of human nature. Following from this behavior of the state as a self seeking egoist is thus understood to be merely a reflection of the characteristics of people that comprise the state. It is human nature that explains why international politics is necessarily power politics. Convinced of the unchanging human nature, classical realists are highly pessimistic with regard to the possibility of any qualitative transformation of world politics. As a result, they tend to rely much more upon conventional principles of diplomacy and mechanisms, such as balance of power, international morality, and world public opinion, and international law, for regulating and restraining the inevitable clashes of interest between states than on the human nature. Now, the point is, what is contemporary realism or neo realism? Contemporary realism, also called neo realism and structural realism, is a more recent strand of realism that developed during the 1980s under the influence of the Kenneth Walsh. While neo-realists continue to acknowledge the central importance of power, they tend to explain events in terms of the structure of the international system rather than the goals and makeup of individual state. The structure of the international system for the neo-realist is a major determinant of state behavior. It is through an analysis of the different structures of the international system, defined in terms of ordering principles, the functional differentiation of the units, and distributions of capabilities, that the neo-realists tend to explain the varying pattern of world politics. This, they believe, cannot be explained simply in terms of the interest and policies of the individual countries. Unlike the classical realists who trace the causes of war to the innate human nature, the neo-realists tend to explain international conflict within the framework of the anarchic structure of the international system. This basically means that there is no overarching central authority to enforce rules and norms or protect the interest of the larger global community. In other words, it is not so much the innate human nature as the anarchical system, which nurtures fear, jealousy, suspicion, and insecurity in the international system. The structural realists insist that conflict can emerge even if the actors have benevolent intent towards each other. This form of structural realism is most often associated with Kenneth Walsh's landmark book, The Theory of International Politics. Walsh's structural realism has had a major impact on scholars in international relations. Walsh, popularly as a structural realist, emanates from his ringing assertion that the structure of the international system decisively shapes the behavior of the state. According to Watts, anarchy prevents states from entering into cooperative agreements to end the state of war. The condition of anarchy, absence of a higher power over and above the sovereign nation state to ensure peace among them, is often viewed as synonymous to a state of war. By the state of war, structural realists do not intend to convey the impression that large scale war is a daily occurrence in international politics. Rather, the possibility that a particular state may resort to force indicates that the outbreak of war is always a likely scenario in an anarchical environment. Put differently, the structure of the international system can drive states to war even if state leaders desire peace. Structural realists insist that the form of a state, for example, a democracy or a totalitarianism state, or the personality of the leader is less important in accounting for the phenomena of war than the fact that action takes place within the context of an anarchical realm. However, Kenneth Walt's theory of structural realism is not the only version of neo-realism. A second group of contemporary realists, prominent among whom is Joseph Griso, have integrated Watt's idea with the ideas of more traditional realists such as Hans Morgenthau, Raymond Aron, Stanley Hoffman, and Robert Gilpin to construct a contemporary or modern realist profile. Griso represents a group of neo-realists or modern realists who are critical of neoliberal institutionalists who claim states are mainly interested in absolute gains. Griso claims that all states are interested in both absolute and relative gains and in the question of how such gains are distributed in the international system. Such neo-realistic, however, identify two barriers to international cooperation: fear of those who might not follow the rules and relative gains of others. There is yet another version, the third version of neo-realism, which is increasingly becoming popular as security studies. This form of neo-realism is further divided into two subgroups: offensive neo-realism and defensive neo-realism. While offensive neo-realist emphasizes the importance of relative power, the defensive neo-realists are often confused with neoliberal institutionalists, a branch of liberalism, which will be taken up in detail in the next unit. Like traditional realists, the offensive neo-realists believe that the conflict is inevitable in the international system and leaders must always be wary of expansionary powers. The defensive neo-realist, on the other hand, recognizes the cost of war and argues that if inevitably results from irrational forces in a society. Moreover, they argue that it is the presence of the expansionary forces in the international system always willing to use force, which makes it impossible to coexist in the world without weapons. They do, however, concede that the cooperation can take place but is likely to be successful only among the friendly states. However, all this has evoked strong reaction from a number of scholars. Several critics point out that contemporary realists like Watts, who construct a realist theory, without relying on an assumption about human nature tend to assume that states are competitive and egoistic entities. Moreover, in the work of contemporary structural realists, these states appear to be prior to the interactions of states as though they existed before the game of power politics began. We shall come back to some of the more general criticisms of the realist approach later on in the unit. One more immediate concern here, however, is to identify some of the key concepts frequently used in the realist approach to the study of international politics in our next lecture. Here we want to wind up today's lecture. Thank you so much for your attention.